Good afternoon and welcome to our RSK Biosenses First Thursday Club for October. I'm Gavin Wilson, I'm a Director in RSK Biosenses and I'm very pleased to be joined today by my colleague Mark Lang, who's going to speak to us about biodiversity net gain in Wales and Scotland. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So your microphones will be muted throughout the talk, but if you do want to ask a question, then you can do that via the questions box on the screen. And please do so, as there should be time at the end for discussion. Shortly after the end of the talk, you'll be sent a short questionnaire, and if you have a few minutes to provide some feedback, we would really appreciate it, as it helps us to decide how the seminar runs in future. So by way of introductions, Mark is a Technical Director in RSK Biosenses. He is a Chartered Ecologist and a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Managers. He's a botanist and ornithologist by background, and now he leads on BNG and Biodiversity Net Gain in RSK Biosenses. And he has technical expertise delivering biodiversity improvements for large-scale developments and increasingly for renewable energy schemes. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mark to tell us about how biodiversity net gain in Wales and Scotland differs from each other and to the approach in England. So over to you, Mark.
Hi guys, good to meet you all. What I'm going to talk about briefly today is just a high-level review how the approach to net gain might differ in Wales and Scotland and what the direction of travel is looking like in the devolved administrations. There'll be some take-home messages. I'll do a quick signposting to some good resources that are out there, and I'm hoping there'll be sufficient time at the end for a decent question and answer session. So this talk will be slightly less than half an hour, I think, so that will give us just some more time for questions at the end. And just to be clear, it is relatively high level. I didn't want to put too much information in, so that there will be obvious things that I've either forgotten or mislaid, so just bear with me and I'll turn my camera off. Right, hopefully that should be off. So, as we're probably all aware, in England, the biodiversity net gain approach is based on the Deca metric, and this is an accounting tool. So it's an Excel spreadsheet which is used to assign habitats of biodiversity value, with the value being calculated based on the distinctiveness and condition of a habitat along with its strategic significance. And it does allow for a prescriptive approach to qualifying habitat losses and gains. And we will touch on the strategic significance element in a little bit more detail, because this is where we're looking at where habitat creation might be most beneficial, particularly if we're within nature recovery areas or local nature recovery strategies. There's a lot of work going on at the moment in terms of biodiversity opportunity mapping and local authorities and natural England producing local nature recovery strategies and where biodiversity enhancements would be best placed. And this is often forgotten with the metric because we're obviously focused on delivering 10% and focused on the numbers, but we'll come back to that. So in Wales, the approach is termed net benefit for biodiversity rather than biodiversity net gain. It has the same overall intent in that the Welsh Government is looking for biodiversity to deliver an overall improvement, looking for development to deliver an overall improvement in biodiversity, but it doesn't mandate the use of a metric. That's not to say that you can't use a metric. Indeed, it's not to say that you couldn't use the Deca metric, just in terms of quantifying habitat losses and gains, but use of the metric on its own wouldn't be enough to adhere to planning legislation in Wales. And in Wales, the emphasis is on a wider proactive consideration of biodiversity, but also ecosystem service benefit, ecosystem resilience, which we'll come on to in a bit, and getting involved early in the process. So ecologists involved early on in the development process. So in many ways, Wales is a much more qualitative approach, I think. And the 2016 Environment Act Wales brought in a new duty requiring all public authorities to maintain and enhance biodiversity, but in doing so, they must also promote the resilience of ecosystems. And this is quite important in the Welsh context. There's a lot of emphasis placed on ecosystem resilience and making things better for Wales in the long term. So not just thinking about biodiversity net gain, but thinking slightly wider than that. So all development in Wales should contribute to biodiversity, but also ecosystem resilience and the delivery of wider ecosystem services. Now, the onus will be on the developer to demonstrate how they will deliver this, including evidence, if required, of site management. So if a development is going to need to create or restore habitat to offset its biodiversity impacts, then the developer will need to show evidence of that, and also that they have the resources to do this for as long as is necessary. So it's not quite as prescriptive in Wales as it is with the Deca metric, where we have a spreadsheet to record the habitat gains and losses, and we know that we need to deliver that for 25 to 30 years. It's not quite as prescriptive in Wales. So helpfully, when we're considering ecosystem resilience, Natural Resources Wales has published a framework for evaluating ecosystem resilience, and this is based on 5 attributes and is known as Deca, so the Deca framework. And we're considering diversity, extent, condition, connectivity, and aspects of ecosystem resilience, which is a combination of all the first 4 attributes. So when we're considering ecosystem resilience, and we'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide, we're looking at our development site. Where does our development site sit in the local and regional landscape? What's the existing ecosystem resilience to external pressures, both direct and indirect, and how will our development proposals affect that resilience, and how will any mitigation enhancement we put forward deliver improved ecosystem resilience, on the basis that Wales is looking for net benefit and it's looking to drive ecosystem resilience forward and improving the resilience as we go forward. So I do get a bit lost with this, I must say, because there's quite a lot here, but diversity is considering diversity at all levels and at all scales. So it's diversity between trophic layers, it's genetic diversity, species diversity, all of that really. Extent is looking at how big our development is, and also looking at enhancement measures which maintain and increase the area of semi-natural habitat, and also linkages between them, on the basis that the more habitat we have and the better linked it is, then the more resistant that ecosystem will be to external pressures from things like climate change, whatever it may be. Condition, so we're looking at existing condition of an ecosystem, and ecosystems are affected by multiple and complex issues, both indirect and direct pressures. So things like climate change, invasive species, agricultural improvement, people, recreation pressure, all of these things are acting on habitat condition. And if habitats are in a much better condition, then again, the ecosystem resilience to those pressures is higher. Connectivity, so we're looking at things here like stepping stones, wildlife corridors, areas of small habitat in the wider landscape that form a network. So if perhaps we needed to consider marsh fritillary or great crested newt, both of these are species that suffer from regular extinction events, and they need they exist as metapopulations in the wider landscape, so they need areas of habitat that are well connected in the wider landscape to enable them to recover from extinction events going forward. So marsh fritillary suffer with what's the word I'm looking for? So it's a parasite that affects them quite highly, and great crested newts obviously are dependent on ponds still being extant, and some years it's drier than others, and some ponds can be used and some can't, that sort of thing. And the final element is really just pulling it all together, which is aspects of ecosystem resilience. So by looking at all of the previous 4 aspects, we're in a position to be able to assess what the ecosystem resilience of our development site is like, what the resilience of the wider landscape is, the contribution to ecosystem resilience that any enhancements we're proposing might make, and also what impact our development is going to have. Helpfully, because this is quite nebulous and does require quite a lot of thought, NRW have published 2 guides that are really useful. So there's an ecosystem resilience field guide and a networks handbook. So it gives some good examples, so both ambitious and less ambitious messages, but also rules of thumb for each of the Deca attributes. So these are a really useful place to start when we're considering our ecosystem resilience assessment as part of the net benefit assessment. The legislation and guidance in Wales is also quite clear that we need to make sure that any biodiversity enhancements we're prescribing are appropriate to the local environment and also likely to be efficacious. So there is a strong emphasis placed on reviewing lots of information that's out there at a kind of national and local scale. So Wales has just published 4 strategic development plans, and these sit below the local plan, but they sit above the local development plans, and these set out some strategic directions in which Wales wants to travel. So this is a useful place to start when evaluating what contributions your development and the net benefit you're suggesting can contribute towards some of the national objectives. It's looking at things like Section 7 habitats and species area statements, the latest state of the natural resources report. So this it's been quite damning for Wales, but it's also been quite damning for England as well, with the natural environment report, which is just showing that we're continuing to hemorrhage biodiversity at quite a severe rate. And this gives us a good idea about what contributions we can have. So if we do have species or habitats on a site that are suffering a national decline, can we make a positive contribution towards their enhancement and long-term gain, I guess. But also looking at local strategies as well. So biodiversity action plans, green infrastructure assessments. It's kind of just making sure that we can contribute locally and make some meaningful contribution, really. And if it sounds like this might be quite a difficult task, there was a letter published by the Chief Planner to all of the planners in Wales. And that letter suggests that biodiversity net benefit shouldn't be onerous, but what it must be, and quite importantly, is proportional to the extent and impact of development that's occurring. So this will mean that small developments can deliver net benefit relatively easily, whereas other schemes will need to invest. Perhaps they need to create habitat or restore habitat. So they're going to need to deliver land area for net benefit, and they're going to need to maintain habitats in the long term. So very similar to the English approach, where we know that if you're losing all of your habitats on site, you're going to need to do something off site, and you need to manage those habitats for at least 30 years. So there are suggestions that net benefit for biodiversity can be achieved through a range of actions, which could be as simple as bat and bird box provision through to large-scale habitat creation and restoration. But what's obviously fairly clear is that a large-scale development with lots of biodiversity impact is not going to get away with just providing half a dozen bird boxes. So proportional to the extent and impact is the important thing to consider. But what it does mean is that very simple low-scale development doesn't have to deliver net benefit on the scale of a large development scheme. And the guidance suggests it will be the local authority that will be the arbiter, and the local planning authority, that will decide on whether what developers put forward is appropriate. So it's not so prescribed as for England, and it just means that we as ecologists and our developer clients are just going to have to work harder, I think. So if I'm giving you a methodology for Wales, so we're encouraged as ecologists to take a whole system approach when conducting our impact assessment and prescribing biodiversity enhancement. So we need to consider the biodiversity value of our site, its ecosystem resilience. So this is baseline before development, also after development. What contributions are we going to make? So it's setting the framework, I guess, in which our development sits. So it's ensuring any enhancements we prescribe are going to be locally appropriate, and also enhance ecosystem benefit in ecosystem service in the sort of wider landscape. And there's quite a lot of emphasis on, can we think about and deliver multiple ecosystem service benefit? And this is certainly something that Biocensus and also Wilding, the other RSK company that I work for, try to think about. So if we need to prescribe flood mitigation, can we also deliver biodiversity within that? If we're creating habitat, can we create habitat that can cope and allow for a large amount of public recreation to deliver kind of amenity benefit, that sort of thing? If we're looking at scrub and trees, can we think about carbon sequestration? Are we able to restore peatland habitat in terms of carbon, that sort of thing? So if we're doing one thing, can we tick more than one box and deliver wider ecosystem service? And it's also encourages us to talk to our colleagues in hydrology and transport and just have a more kind of joined up approach and avoid working in silos, I guess. And also thinking about existing and potential linkages with wider green infrastructure networks. So can our habitat creation help link a cycle path, or is there a biodiversity opportunity area where we can link two blocks of ancient woodland? Or if we create habitat here, that would benefit dormouse existing in two fragmented populations, that sort of thing. Right, that's it for Wales. So Scotland, different again, and I haven't been able to provide us or find as much information in relation to Scotland. That might just be because it's buried, or I suspect that Scotland is just slightly behind the curve in relation to biodiversity, and it's probably had different things on the political agenda that it's more worried about. So I think Scotland is catching up fast though. So under the National Policy Framework 4, there is an emphasis for development to achieve significant biodiversity enhancement. There was quite a lot of discussion within Scotland. There's been a few research papers out there looking at the pros and cons of using a metric-based approach as we have in England. And initially, Scotland was not necessarily going down that route. It didn't look like that would be the direction of travel. But February this year, there was a detailed review published, and Nature Scot are likely to be developing some kind of metric to support policy 3B. So to support significant biodiversity enhancement, it's likely in Scotland that there will be a metric-based approach as we have in England. But obviously, any metric for Scotland will need to be adapted to ensure it's relevant, because habitat condition, habitat distinctiveness are all different in Scotland, and we have habitats in Scotland that we don't have in the rest of the UK. So we certainly don't have Caledonian pine forest. The approach for peat in Scotland needs to be well considered, because Scotland has a huge peat resource, has the largest peat resource in the UK. Also, biodiversity credits are currently not in contemplation. So the English government has stated that if development can't deliver biodiversity benefit on site, can't find an off-site partner, then you can buy biodiversity credits from the government, which will be used to deliver enhancements elsewhere. But that's currently not in contemplation in Scotland. And also, I've not seen any evidence that Scotland is proposing to have a nationally set minimum level of biodiversity enhancement. So in England, we've set it at 10%, and in Scotland, we're just looking at significant enhancements. So again, I think it will be up to the developer and their ecology partners to produce a well thought through scheme that's delivering significant enhancement. Again, as in England, on-site enhancement should be favoured, but off-site is likely to be accepted as an alternative. And I think we will see habitat banking and offsetting, and I think there will be increased working between developers and landowners who want to deliver off-site. What there is in Scotland, as in England actually, but there are some quite nice examples of where local planning authorities have been acting in a sort of biodiversity delivery approach without recourse to deframetric. And the one I liked particularly was Border Council, because there's a huge amount of wind farm development in the Borders region. They've sat themselves down with local stakeholders and thinking about how they account for the residual impacts of wind farm development. So because of the collective and cumulative pressure, each of the wind farm developments might offset the majority of its impacts, but there's always going to be a small residual. And how can they deal with that residual impact? So they've identified sites where habitat enhancement can occur that would have real delivery for biodiversity and enhanced networks within the wider landscape. And this has considered things like bespoke management for black grouse, restoration of peatland, appropriate woodland planting, that sort of thing. And overall, there's been more than 3 million quid's worth of resources attracted in. So by contributing, the wind farm stakeholders are, they're offsetting the majority of their impacts on site, but by contributing and working with a wider partnership, benefits are delivered off site that are making quite a significant contribution in the wider Borders landscape. So it's a good example of kind of thinking outside of the box and thinking in a joined up, slightly more strategic way. So my take home messages. So all three approaches have the same aims. So it's to understand the biodiversity impacts of a development and also to put forward a well-considered joined-up approach that delivers significant gain. I think the Scottish approach at the moment is slightly more akin to the English quantitative approach, with emphasis placed on biodiversity enhancement rather than a prescribed level of biodiversity gain, whereas in Wales, slightly more qualitative, taking a whole system approach, considering a site's biodiversity value as well as the ecosystem resilience within which that site sits, and also the contribution to delivering wider ecosystem service. But as I talked about earlier, within the English system, so looking at biodiversity net gain, we do have the strategic significance element where we are considering areas that are obviously biodiversity opportunity areas, areas that obviously link habitats together, have a higher value than areas where they won't do the same. So the English approach does have a qualitative element to it as well. And I think if assessment is well done to delivering biodiversity benefit, we're really taking on board both a qualitative and a quantitative approach. And I think there are lessons to be learnt here, because I think we can learn from our Welsh colleagues, and that the Deca framework is quite a useful tool for assessing our biodiversity enhancements and our impact assessment, setting it in the kind of landscape and looking at what contribution and how sensitive ecosystems are in terms of ecosystem resilience. But also, I think the approach that England and Scotland have taken, a metric is a very useful way of recording quite simply habitat losses and gains, and it's a very useful accounting tool. But I think the important thing is that we need to focus on outcome rather than focus on the process. And there's quite a lot of criticism at the moment of the deframetric, and there will also be criticism of the Welsh approach, and that we can be negative about it, but what we should be focusing on is the outcome, not actually how we got there. But if we're thinking properly and we're working in a joined up manner, whatever system we're using, we should get to the same answer, because at the end of the day, the answer is always going to be the same once we've assessed impacts and we understand what the mitigation measures are going to be required. So I think ecologists need to understand the differences, and we need to understand the country that we're working in. Legislation's different, everything's different really, the policy framework is different, and we do tend, I think, as ecologists to be a little bit English centric, particularly if we're based in England. But I, for example, do work and involved with teams that are working in both Scotland and England, and you know, we just need to understand and get much better at it. We do need to ensure that ecology input happens at an early stage. We've all tried to shoehorn a master plan into the DEFRA metric. Doesn't always work. It's much better if we're involved at an early stage. And there is, I think, a considerable amount of upskilling required within ecologists. It's kind of, I know net gain and it's been out there for a while, and we've all known it's coming, but it has kind of crept up on us quite quickly. And we've just launched within Biosensors what we're calling BNG University, which is just trying to get all of our ecologists up to the same level, because we're having to think of some quite profound things now. So we're needing to make sure that we record habitat condition for baseline in a much better manner. We're needing to consider the implications of what we're suggesting in terms of habitat enhancements. We need to understand, you know, we need to become habitat managers, we need to become habitat creators, which is not something that all ecologists necessarily do. And there's a huge amount of CPD here, so we are required by SIEM 30 hours per year, whatever it is. So if you need some CPD ideas, there are plenty of them, and net gain is something where we need to focus. And also, we did a thing recently where it's quite clear that we don't particularly understand the subtle changes in terms of legislation between the devolved administrations, and that's something that we need to have a much better understanding of. So we need to understand the policy and legislative framework, and just that, yeah, and how things are different really. So just in terms of signposting to resources, there's information out there on the net. The English government and DEFRA have done a really good job at pulling all of the net gain information related to England together. So where the DEFRA metric version 4 sits, all of the, as they're developing, all of the information and guidance is being published there, which is quite useful, so keep up to date with it. And SIEM produced 2 very useful briefing notes. The one for Wales is particularly useful. It sets out the signposting for all of the policy and legislative stuff for Wales, and also all of the information, guidance and manuals in relation to the Deca framework are all there. That's very useful. There's also some good briefing for Scotland. They were slightly less helpful, I think, just because Scotland is slightly behind the curve with biodiversity gain, and I think we will see more guidance coming from Scotland. I'm also hoping that perhaps SIEM, as they seem to be doing, are doing a good job in kind of bringing all of the biodiversity information together, and how the approach might be different across the devolved administrations. And hopefully we can see SIEM acting as a bit of an information hub. They've done a good job to date, and I see no reason why that won't change going forward. And it's certainly one of the things that we will perhaps be lobbying them for, just to see whether they can take on that role and bringing all of the information together, because at the moment stuff is, it can be quite hard to find. It's a bit of a Google search and trying to find things. And that's it from me really. So I think that was just under half an hour, so I will open it up for questions.
Amazing, thanks, Mark. You want to pop your camera back on? That'd be great.
Yeah,
there we go.
I think I've done that.
You are. We can see you. Brilliant. So thanks so much. That was fab. Yeah, it's great to have an overview of how the different approaches line up in one sort of overview. And if I may say, it's a typically complex kind of policy situation in the UK between, you know, the different countries trying to achieve the same end. Kind of typical of us, really, as an overall comment. We've got a bit of time.
We like to be complicated, don't we?
Indeed. Yeah. So like you say, we've got a bit of time. Thanks very much for that. and we've got a few questions, and I'll pick up on a few of them now. So we've got one here. So it was what you were talking about at the end, really. So and about upskilling. So do you think we as an industry have got the number of people with the skills and the ability to do the BNG work to the standard that we need it to happen? You know,
No,
across the different approaches, the baseline surveys, the assessments.
No, to be frank, I think we're getting there, and I think we're getting much better as an industry. But I certainly don't think we have the core skills in terms of things like botanical ability to be able to understand the habitat survey, do the condition assessment, because that's all botany based. And although I think it is getting better, so we're seeing much more emphasis on training. So things like the FISC assessment that BSBI introduced, where people can go and have their botanical ability assessed. I'm seeing more and more people with evidence that they do have the botanical skills to it. And certainly within RSK, we have a fairly strong emphasis on training with our own training provider. So I think we are getting there, but I think there's a way to go. I also think there are skills that we haven't necessarily realised that we need to learn yet. So we need to understand habitat management a bit better, because we're prescribing habitat enhancements. We need to understand, you know, standard agricultural operations. How do we conduct a hay cut, grazing rates, all of that sort of thing. So there's quite a lot of information for us to learn, I think. And it's understanding, I think, the implications of using the DEFRA metric, because we might say we have grassland of poor quality and we'll get it to good condition, but it's what that implication means, and also understanding our clients' capabilities. So have they got the equipment and the ability to manage habitat? Are we going to outsource it? There are lots of unanswered questions, I think, and I think we've got a way to go, but I think we are beginning to understand, and certainly SIEM has done a load of biodiversity training. We're seeing it, much more emphasis placed on it. So I think we're getting there, but I think there's a way to go. That's probably the short answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I mean, I think it's right. I'm right in saying that it puts a lot of emphasis on botanical skills, which maybe in our industry hasn't been the most, you know, there's been a bit of a focus maybe more on protected species and things, but it's putting a focus back on botany.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's a couple of questions on the same vein, which is about, do you think there is or there's going to be a way to assess the sort of relative success of the different approaches in terms of biodiversity gain?
That's a very good question. I think in England, potentially, particularly with off-site habitat enhancement, because all of that will be required to be registered with the off-site register, so that there should be a means of tracking success there. I think where enhancements on-site, probably not, because that information will go to the local planning authority, and whether or not there's a feedback loop to enable that recording to happen. Scotland and Wales, it's not so certain as to how that will happen, because again, the information will go to the local planning authorities, and how we put that information in the public domain. I mean, local authorities will be required to enforce to make sure that developers are doing what they said they would do. But again, have they got sufficient funding at the moment to do that? I'm not sure they have. I'm not sure actually that anybody's thought about it, particularly in terms of how we actually monitor. Certainly within the English approach, though, because the emphasis is on you enter into a legal agreement between the, particularly if it's offsite, between the habitat provider and the development that needs the gains, then there should be a framework to enable the enforcement and monitoring of that. But it's not something that we thought about very much, I think. It's very similar to the biodiversity action plan process years ago when I was a biodiversity officer with the wildlife trusts. You know, lots of work was occurring across the country, but actually quantifying and recording that was really, really difficult. And there was a system eventually to begin to record and quantify what had happened, but it's not that transparent, and I think it will happen, but there's more work. Again, I think we're focused on process rather than focusing on the outcome, and there needs to be some kind of mechanism to record the outcome. I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've got there's a question here that says the timescale for BNG in England is 30 years. Does Wales have an equivalent timescale with their approach? And does land have to be secured in the same way to provide sufficient offset?
I think land will, for the scale of development where it's appropriate for it to occur, I think they will have to secure land in a similar way. There doesn't appear to be any minimal or time requirements, but I would imagine if you've got development that's having a big enough impact that you need to create habitats, then you're going to need to think about doing things within a similar time frame, I would have thought. So I certainly don't think you're going to get away with woodland or meadow creation in Wales as an offset, but that you guarantee that you'll only manage it for 5 years. I think developers are going to need to be showing much more commitment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be 30 years. You could, as a developer, sign up to 50 years perhaps, but I certainly think it's going to be timeframes that are comparable. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But again, it'll be the local authority that will decide that, and the local authority that will act as judge and jury, I guess, in terms of if what you're putting forward is appropriate. And I'm guessing we will see some national standards come out of Wales to make sure that local authorities are consistent in their approach, because one of the criticisms at the moment is there's no guarantee that some local authorities won't take a more lenient or a more strict approach to others. So I'm guessing we will see further guidance as the system progresses.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, next up we have, with local planning authorities due to be taking responsibility for the decision making in regards to BNG and planning approval, have you seen any evidence of LPAs upskilling their own teams in being able to do this, or do you think LPAs will lean on ecology companies to provide that input, support and advice?
I think a mixture of both. Certainly within RSK Wilding, we've been involved in advising local authorities on the upskilling they need to do. So both in terms of staff, but also policy, planning conditions, that sort of thing. We've done a lot of work with the local authorities in Leicestershire, and I can also see that some local authorities will probably outsource. So we're already providing biodiversity advice to a number of local authorities in Gloucestershire, and I can see that happening. So I think it will be a combination of both. I think the issue is going to be funding, and although there is some additional funding within England, I don't know the situation in Scotland and Wales, but I certainly think that local authorities funding is not going to be sufficient at the moment, and that's one of the criticisms that's been levelled at whatever approach is taken, that it's a significant upskilling for local authorities because they're going to need ecology expertise, and whether they outsource or upskill their existing staff, I don't think really matters. They're still going to need the resources to pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, there's a couple of questions on the same topic actually. Is any thoughts or insights whether Northern Ireland will have incoming net gain requirements?
Northern Ireland, I've no idea. It's
okay,
not something that I've looked into at all, even though we do as a company work in Ireland and the Republic, well, both Northern Ireland and the Republic as well. It's something I should know the answer to, but I don't.
No, that's fair enough.
It's on my list. On my list of CPD.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a question here. Do you have a view on whether the metric-based approach is likely to be more successful than the more qualitative approaches, or otherwise?
I think to be honest, if we're focused on process rather than outcome, then I think each are either is equally liable to fail. I think we need to be focusing more on outcome, and I think because biodiversity enhancement needs to be joined up, that a metric-based approach is part of it, but we need to think wider than the metric, which is where the strategic significance to a certain extent comes in. But this is where I think that the Deca framework has some value in that sort of wider consideration as to whether your enhancements are realistic, whether they're deliverable, and also what contribution they're going to make to local and national targets and kind of thinking it through in the round is quite important. So I think if you're just focused on numbers and just focused on a spreadsheet, then the potential to fail is quite high. But also if you're not really thinking about the numbers and you're just thinking too widely and you're just thinking ecosystem service, it's kind of got to be a joined up, considered approach. So it's got to have elements of both in it. And I think we all know when we do biodiversity enhancement well, we know what works and we know what doesn't, because it's well thought through, and we've been involved at an early stage and we've used our brains, and we've got a joined up process, and we're working with the developer and landscape architects and local authority and all of that. So it's all a joined up, well coordinated process, but that doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That goes back to what you said earlier about, you know, CPD and upskilling and developing people's skills.
Yeah.
In this area completely.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we've still got a couple of minutes. We've got a couple of questions still. A question here saying, do BNG requirements also apply to permitted development schemes or projects?
Good question. And again, I don't think I have an answer to that. I think it probably does on one level, but I'm fairly sure there are some loopholes that haven't been ironed out yet. I certainly know that for some of the utility developers that we're working on, they have their own internal standards and commitments towards biodiversity that they're looking to discharge, so they will apply those even when development is permitted development. But that's a good question. That's something we'll have to take away and
we can check that. We can take that away.
Yeah, no, it's very good question
though. Yeah, so we've got one here. Is there any ideas or / templates for reports in Scotland yet?
I haven't seen anything in Scotland.
So maybe still in development.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they don't exist, because I find finding information in Scotland quite difficult. It's difficult to navigate, so there might be information, but I've not seen it yet. And I suspect Scotland is just a little bit behind the curve in relation to that. We've just seen England, DEFRA, publish the template for what a biodiversity enhancement report is likely to look like in terms of lodging a site on the off-site register. So I'm guessing a similar framework will follow and a similar template. But yes, we're beginning to see those for England, certainly. And Wales, there isn't a template for an approach, really. It's up to you as the developer and ecologist to define the approach within the guidelines they've given.
Great stuff. Okay, that was the last question that we've had through, and we are pretty much there time-wise.
Cool, that was good.
So,
enjoyed that.
Thank you very much. That was amazing, incredibly useful session. Yeah, so we're at the end.
Thank you to people for taking the time out and listening. So,
absolutely, yeah. Just to wrap up, please take a moment if you can to complete our questionnaire. Just leaves me, to say thanks again to you, Mark, and to everybody for joining us. And finally, one for the calendars. So our next and last First Thursday Club of the year will be on the 7th of December. That'll be presented by Ayushi Bhatnagar, and that'll be called Net Zero Transition Planning. And that's us. Have a good day. Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, guys. All the best.